It was a bright, sunny afternoon when Rudi, a 28-year-old man, drove down the winding road that led to his late grandmother's house. The house, located at the edge of a small village, had always been a place of warmth and comfort during his childhood. However, since his grandmother's passing a few years ago, the house had fallen into neglect. Vines crept up the sides and the windows were covered with dust, giving the home a forgotten, eerie feeling. Rudi had always cherished the memories of his visits to his grandmother's house. He remembered the smell of freshly baked cookies, the warmth of her hugs, and the endless stories she would tell him. It was a place full of love and joy, but now it seemed as though the house itself had absorbed the silence that had settled in after her death. He knew it was time to go through her belongings and clear the house. It was a task he had been avoiding for too long, but today he felt it was finally the right moment. As he entered the living room, his heart ached with nostalgia. Everything was just as he remembered it, except for the thick layer of dust covering every surface. He began his work, picking up old photo frames and books, setting them aside. Then something caught his eye. A doll. It was sitting on the old wooden table near the window, its faded dress and stitched smile creating an odd, almost unsettling presence in the room. Rudi had never seen this doll before. It didn't belong to his grandmother, at least not that he could recall. It looked old, ancient even. The porcelain face had cracks in it, and its eyes seemed to be staring back at him with an intensity that made him uneasy. Rudi shrugged off the discomfort. Perhaps it had been a gift from someone or something his grandmother had kept for sentimental reasons. He decided to leave it where it was and continued cleaning the house. That night, after finishing the majority of his cleaning, Rudi returned to the living room to take a break. As he entered the room, he immediately noticed something strange. The doll, which had been sitting on the table earlier, was now perched on the old chair by the window. Rudi froze. Had he moved the doll himself? He couldn't remember. It was possible, but the thought left him feeling unsettled. He was sure he hadn't touched it. Trying to dismiss the odd occurrence as a trick of his mind, he set the doll back on the table and went to bed, hoping to sleep away the unease that had settled in his chest. But the next day, the same thing happened. Every time Rudi would leave the house and return, the doll would be in a different spot. Sometimes it was on the table, other times it would be sitting on the chair, or even near the door, as if waiting for him. At first, Rudi thought nothing of it. Perhaps he was simply forgetting where he'd placed it, or perhaps it was his imagination playing tricks on him. But soon, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The doll was no longer just a simple, inanimate object. It seemed to have a mind of its own. As days passed, the doll's movements became more noticeable, and Rudi began feeling like he was being watched. The house, which had once been so familiar and comforting, now felt like a prison of strange occurrences and dark secrets. The feeling of dread was building inside him. One night, as Rudi sat in the living room writing some notes, he heard something. It was a faint sound, like someone walking softly through the room. Rudi stopped what he was doing, straining to listen. He could hear nothing except the wind rustling outside and the ticking of the old wall clock. He thought it was nothing, just his imagination, until he heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. His heart raced as the footsteps grew louder. Then, unexpectedly, the lights flickered, and in the dim light he saw the doll move. Its head tilted slightly as though acknowledging his presence. Rudi's breath caught in his throat. He had to be imagining things, right? Perhaps he was just exhausted from the work, or the stress of being alone in the house was getting to him. He tried to brush it off and continue working, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. Suddenly, the doll's eyes seemed to focus more intently on him. It was as though it was alive. Rudi felt a chill run down his spine. He stood up, unsure of what to do. That was when he heard it. A voice, soft and familiar. "Rudi, Rudi." The voice was unmistakable. It was his grandmother's voice, though it sounded distant, almost like an echo from the past. His mind raced. How could this be? His grandmother had passed away years ago, but there was no mistaking it. The doll was speaking to him. Rudi slowly stepped toward the doll, unsure if he should touch it or leave the room. But before he could move any further, the doll spoke again. "Rudi, you must know the truth." The voice was filled with sorrow, and for the first time, Rudi felt like the house itself was alive with secrets. The doll began to tell a story, one that Rudi had never heard before, a story about his grandmother's past, one that was hidden deep in the shadows of their family history. Many years ago, his grandmother had a sister, Rudi's great-aunt, who had mysteriously disappeared. It wasn't an accident, as everyone had believed. His great-aunt had been the victim of a dark family ritual, one that had been practiced for generations. The ritual was meant to maintain the family's wealth and power, but it came at a terrible cost. His great-aunt had been sacrificed in the ritual, and her spirit was trapped, bound to the doll. The doll had been made to carry her soul, a soul that could never find peace. As Rudi listened, he felt as if the ground beneath him was giving way. The doll continued, revealing that his grandmother had been forced into the ritual, and that the family's wealth and fortune had come from this dark pact. The doll, now holding the spirit of his great-aunt, had been passed down through generations to remind them of the price they had paid. Rudi could hardly process what he was hearing. The truth about his family's past was horrifying. His grandmother, the woman he had loved so dearly, had been complicit in something so dark and terrifying. But the worst part was that the spirits of those sacrificed were still trapped, unable to move on, unable to rest. And now it was up to Rudi to free them. Determined to make things right, Rudi searched for a way to end the curse that had plagued his family for so long. He spent days reading through old journals and talking to the elders in the village. Finally, he found the ritual, an ancient ceremony that could purify the doll and release the trapped spirits. He gathered the necessary items and prepared himself for the difficult task ahead. As night fell, Rudi stood in the living room, the doll in his hands. He began the ritual, reciting the incantations from the old book. The air grew thick with tension, and for a moment, Rudi felt the presence of the spirits surrounding him. He could feel the weight of their suffering, the centuries of pain and anguish. But as he finished the final words of the ritual, something changed. The air lightened and the room seemed to relax. The doll, once so animated, became still. The energy that had been trapped inside it dissipated. Rudi felt a sense of peace wash over him. The following morning, Rudi looked at the doll one last time. It lay motionless on the floor, no longer the sinister object it had been. For the first time in days, Rudi felt a sense of calm. He had freed his family from the burden of their dark past. The spirits of his great-aunt and all those before her could finally rest. Rudi knew that he would never forget what he had learned. The house was still filled with memories, but it no longer held the weight of its dark secrets. With the curse lifted, he walked out of the house, leaving behind the past, but carrying with him the lessons he had learned. The house, once haunted by its history, was finally free. As he closed the door behind him, Rudi felt a strange sense of relief. The silence of the house was no longer a burden. It was a peaceful quiet. a quiet that signaled the end of the nightmare that had haunted his family for so long.